Max Baker-Hytch. Welcome to the show.
Miles, thank you very much for having me.
So I want to talk to you about near-death experiences. It's a very heavy topic, but I think we're equipped to deal with it. So my first question for you, Max, is what is a near-death experience? What's just kind of the general definition that maybe clinicians use, or that is neutral with respect to an afterlife or not? I'm assuming there's a definition that's just the scientific analysis of the term. What is a near-death experience?
Yeah, so I don't think there's a single agreed upon definition, but broadly, I think people on either side of this sort of philosophical debate that we're going to talk about would broadly agree that it's an experience that occurs when someone is in a critical condition, medically speaking, not necessarily without a heartbeat or brain waves, but, and we'll probably get into this, there are some cases in which it's alleged that someone has some kind of experience in that state. But yeah, it's generally someone is in a critical condition, they're unconscious, they probably score poorly on what's known as the Glasgow Coma Scale. So they're unresponsive, and despite being in that condition, medically speaking, they report once they become conscious again that they had typically a very lucid experience, and there will often be there are a number of features that are quite common to these types of experiences. So famously, people will experience going down a tunnel and going towards a light at the end. Sometimes they'll report encountering dead loved ones. They'll sometimes report encountering a being of light and love. They'll sometimes report having a life review, looking back at their own life and the impact that their decisions and actions had on others. And I mean, arguably the most interesting is where people will report observing their own bodies from an out-of-body perspective, and let's say observing the medical staff trying to resuscitate them, that sort of thing, or even viewing events somewhat further afield, terrestrial, earthly events, if you like, a bit further afield. But yeah, those would be and some of the key characteristics that you'll find coming up in a lot of these cases.
So what would be the 2 or 3 most powerful examples in your mind of a near-death experience? I imagine those would be the cases that are most difficult to explain from a naturalistic perspective where there is no afterlife. So if you could walk us through at least a few of those, and then we can begin to analyze how we could best explain those cases.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the types of cases that are most interesting in terms of their potential evidential import are ones where the person during their NDE seems to witness events that they recount when they wake up. And where others are able to corroborate the details of the things they see. So yeah, in the paper I've written on this, which is coming out.
Yeah, give the title and where
sure.
people can find it.
So yep, it's coming out in Agathos, European Journal for Philosophy of Religion. And the title is Glimpses into the Great Beyond, on the evidential value of near-death experiences. So yeah, I give 3 cases that have the features I just described, where the details that someone seems to witness in their NDE can be independently checked. So okay, there's one where that was reported by a surgeon in Toulouse in France. So this woman wasn't in cardiac arrest, but she was anesthetized and she was undergoing surgery. And when she woke up, she described her own operation as if she had been from a perspective on the ceiling. But then and this was the bit that really kind of surprised the surgeon, she described the operation going on in the next theatre. And she described it as the amputation of a leg, and she saw them put the leg in a yellow bag. And the surgeon was so kind of startled by this that he almost immediately went next door and checked, and indeed that operation had just taken place, an amputation of a leg, and they'd put it in a yellow bag for disposal. Okay, another example. So this was reported by a nurse from Hartford Hospital in Connecticut in the US. So there was a woman who had had cardiac arrest and had been resuscitated successfully. And then when she came around again, she told the nurse that she had had this experience of feeling like she was leaving her body, going up through the floors of the hospital, up onto the roof and seeing the skyline of Hartford, and looking down then on the roof of the hospital and seeing out of the corner of her eye, however we should understand that, an object which was a red shoe. And then she reported this to this nurse, who then told I guess a resident, a junior doctor, who was very skeptical. But he then got a janitor to go up on the roof and recover a red shoe from the roof. And this nurse reports that the skeptical junior doctor changed his mind, came to think that there was something to this experience. I'll give just one more example. So this one was reported by the director of an ICU unit, who was involved in the resuscitation of a patient called Howard. And so yeah, again, Howard had been in cardiac arrest and they'd managed to resuscitate him. And Howard tells, once he is awake again, he tells the doctor, the director of the ICU, that he had an experience where he had felt himself leave his body, float up through the ceiling of the emergency room, and then into a room which he described as being like having a computer workstation in the middle, and then a number of rooms around it, and containing beds that had people on them. And he said, except they didn't look quite like people. They didn't look real. They looked like mannequins, and they had IVs hooked up to them. And the ICU director describes how his jaw really dropped, because in fact it was the case that right above the emergency room was a nurse training center, where new hires would be trained on these resuscitation dummies that had IVs hooked up to them, and in the center was a workstation with computers and so on. But this wasn't an area that patients ever had access to. It's not something that the doctors would just talk about in front of the patients, that kind of thing. So, but there's many, many more such cases, and that's just kind of a sampling, really.
Well, I think those are fascinating cases because I imagine that those are also some of the most well-documented ones. Like that's why you chose them, because the details have been corroborated. But let me give the simplistic, knee-jerk, naturalistic, physicalist, atheistic reaction to those accounts, which would be that somebody just made them up. But I know you'll argue that's implausible, but how do we know that someone didn't just sit down and concoct this elaborate story about the entire story from beginning to end and the corroboration? What are the relevant facts that we've been able to verify? I assume people independently reporting these things.
Okay, there's a few things to say there. I mean, the first thing is that we're dealing in probabilities here, and you know, we may get into, you know, Bayes' theorem, which is a way that philosophers will commonly, it's a framework that commonly is used to think about probabilities. But certainly, I want to say that it is a possibility that it's all made up. It's not zero, probability zero, but I think there are some reasons for thinking the probability that you know, all of these cases, or the vast majority of such cases, are fabricated. I think that's very unlikely. I mean, one reason is that in almost all cases, the person who has gone on the record with their testimony and the person who was able to check the details and corroborate it was a medical professional. And so I think, when you think about what is it that these people have to gain, it's really unclear that they have anything to gain, and they arguably have a lot to lose. They the theologian, New Testament scholar Dale C. Allison has a book on religious experience, came out in 2022, I think. And he documents the way in which medical professionals and scientists more generally are typically quite nervous to talk about anything like this, any kinds of religious experiences, anything of this nature. They typically are very wary about talking about this stuff openly with colleagues, just for fear of ridicule and that kind of thing. So, I mean, now again, it's quite possible that one or two such cases are fabricated entirely, but yeah, I think it's very unlikely that the vast majority of such cases are complete fabrications.
I mean, I think that that's correct. That it is probably not the case,
Mm-hmm.
however you explain this
Mm-hmm.
naturalistically, that this is all just spun out of whole cloth, as they
Yeah.
say. But if we think of, like, to put it simplistically, the afterlife
Yeah.
hypothesis would be the kind of face value interpretation of these experiences, which would say that it involves a person's soul leaving their body to experience the things around them in an extrasensory way and perhaps then going on into an afterlife. That would be, I think, the most straightforward interpretation of the experience on their own terms. But what are the leading, perhaps scholarly,
Yeah.
naturalistic or physicalist explanations of these accounts that take them seriously, that don't just dismiss
Yeah.
them as fabrications? Explanations from a framework that sees the physical world as all there
Sure.
is.
Yeah, and I think that scholars of a naturalistic persuasion who engage with this generally don't try and say that it's all fabrications. I think generally there is a level of respect for the integrity of the normally, as I said, medical professionals who have gone on the record with these accounts. But so I think it's really going to be the the core of the sort of attempt to explain these experiences naturalistically is going to posit obviously some kind of brain mechanism that is and there's lots of different versions of that, what exactly is going on in the brain, but the gist of it is that when the brain is in a critical state, it's shutting down, as it were, that it produces these sort of extremely lucid experiences, and as if you will, a kind of last gasp of a dying brain. But now, of course, I think that's, even if you think that might be sufficient to account for the fact that there is experience of some kind when a person is comatose or in cardiac arrest, we're going to clearly need more than that to try to account for these cases where the details of the experience, what the person purports to see out of body, seem to match what's actually going on in the world. So,
Right. That explanation by itself wouldn't do
no.
anything to explain why someone, for example, experienced had an experience of seeing a red sock on the roof of the
Right.
hospital, and then lo and behold, there was a red sock there. You can't explain that purely based on internal chemical reactions.
That's right. So then the favored hypothesis, which is the one that's been argued for by Susan Blackmore, Keith Augustine, um, John Martin Fisher, and Benjamin Mitchell Yellin, is what, I don't know if this is the term they all use for it, but I think it's convenient to call it sensory leakage. So, in other words, the ordinary senses of the person picked up information, as it were, kind of subliminally registered information through ordinary means, which then got woven into a hallucination. And you could sort of compare this to if you've ever been asleep and a fire alarm has gone off in the building where you're sleeping, and it's been sort of woven into a dream where you're in a building that's on fire. I think that's roughly going to be the idea. So yeah, the kind of last gasp of a dying brain hypothesis, but then supplemented with this kind of sensory leakage hypothesis to try to get some purchase on these cases where there's corroborated information.
I think that explanation could explain some of the cases, but are there well-documented instances of near-death experiences that put stress on that kind of an explanation that aren't plausibly explained by sensory leakage? Maybe information that they had no access to at all in their conscious life leading up to the near-death experience.
Well, I think so. I mean, in those three cases I described to you earlier, are all in each case, the object that the person saw or the event that they saw was not in the same room as their their surgery or resuscitation was taking place. So let's just very briefly recap them. So the first case I gave, the woman purported to see the surgery taking place in another operating theatre. And so, yeah, I mean, it doesn't look like that's a very good candidate for sensory leakage. I think the next case, the one with the red shoe on the roof, is an even poorer case for poorer candidate for sensory leakage. Yeah, a shoe being up on the roof, presumably, the nurse, the doctors who resuscitated the woman had not gone up on this roof recently, probably ever. So, yeah, it's very unclear how, through ordinary means, this information would have sort of worked its way into her subconscious. The third case, the one where the guy purports to see the sort of nurse training center in the floor above with the mannequins and the IVs hooked up to them. So yeah, I mean, you could say, well, it's possible in some sense of the word possible that the doctors were talking about the nurse training center while they were resuscitating the guy. It is possible, I grant that, but it also seems very unlikely. And again, we're dealing with probabilities when we're thinking about this stuff. So it doesn't seem to me that sensory leakage gets very much purchase on any of these cases.
Let me offer a different kind of style of naturalistic explanation, which doesn't purport to explain particular instances of near-death experiences, but just offers a general explanation of why we have these accounts in the first place. And it's something you mentioned to me a while ago, that one possibility is that for every astounding near-death experience, there's 100 that do not have these fascinating details, that are mundane, or that include details that contradict factual information that we come to know later on. And so, given people's fascination with near-death experiences and the media's proclivity to only report ones that were significant and meaningful and had corroborating evidence, there's kind of a self-selection effect on the experiences people have, which perhaps run the whole gamut of credible all the way to directly contradictory and false. And so it's no surprise then that some of them are going to be accurate just by chance alone, but there's no need to posit any sort of supernatural realm, a soul, and afterlife. It's just going to be the case that there's this self-selection effect. We're only going to hear about the ones that are remarkable.
Yeah.
What do you say?
No, I take this seriously, and in a way, I think this is the best kind of strategy actually for naturalism. Yeah. So and basically, I compare this to the move that some naturalists make in response to the fine-tuning argument for theism, right? So the fine-tuning argument, which I know you've discussed on this channel, very roughly says that that the fundamental physical setup of the universe could have been very different. And if it had been only very slightly different, then we wouldn't have had a universe that could support life. And that's supposed to be some kind of evidence for design or theism. And then one type of response to this is to say, well, hang on, what if our universe isn't the only one? What if, in fact, there's a great multitude of universes that vary with respect to their physical constants, such that you'd expect, at least one of these vast ensemble of universes to have the properties required to be able to give rise to life of our sort. And of course, then this is key, isn't it? The selection effect that you talked about. We're only going to be able to observe the universe that is suitable for life. As conscious observers, we couldn't find ourselves in any other sort of universe. And so actually, it's not surprising after all on naturalism. So not to get into the merits or flaws of that kind of move, but I think the strategy we're now talking about for trying to explain NDEs is a bit like that. Would that sound plausible to you, that it sort of parallels it in some ways?
I think it absolutely does. The one weakness, I think, facing the attempt to have that kind of an explanation for near-death experiences is that, unlike universes well beyond any observational capacities we will ever have, completely inaccessible to us, we do have access to the range, or at least somewhat of the range, of near-death experiences. These are things that happen in our vicinity. And so it seems like if there really were a huge range of different evidentially significant near-death experiences, we would know about it. I mean, do we? Is that the case? Do we know about, like, for every one genuine I say genuine, but for every one
or veridical,
evidentially significant one, there are 100 that are contradictory or neutral.
And this is the thing. I think you're absolutely right. There is a difference here because, okay, let's just grant, for the sake of argument, that the multiverse, the appeal to the multiverse, the ensemble of universes, that's bound to throw up at least one life-permitting universe. Let's suppose that's a cogent move. I think that the parallel move with NDEs doesn't work nearly as well, and the reason is the one you've alluded to. We do have some sense of the frequency with which NDEs occur, and we have some sense of the frequency at which NDEs containing these kinds of apparent observational details occur, and it seems like the accuracy rate, the hit rate, if you like, so far as we can tell, is too high to be accounted for in this way. So let me just expand on that briefly. So let me put it like this. Suppose that we have an NDE where someone sees, let's say it's a red shoe on the roof. Now, I think we can all agree it's very difficult to put any very precise probability on, what are the odds of correctly guessing there's a red shoe on the roof. It's kind of hard to think about that. But let's just suppose it's 1 in 1,000. I think it's a lot less than 1 in 1,000, really. But let's just suppose it's 1 in 1,000. Well, okay, then if we want to run this sort of multiverse style move for NDEs, it looks like the probabilistic resources we need to posit in terms of NDEs that get swept under the carpet or ignored. We need roughly 1,000 NDEs that didn't get the details quite right for every one accurate case, like the red shoe on the roof, for example. We need 1,000. If it's 1 in 1,000 that the odds of getting it right by chance, we need 1,000 that didn't get it quite right, something like that, right? There at least needs to be some kind of proportionality between the odds of the details being right by chance and the probabilistic resources that we can posit. And the problem is that it doesn't look like there are that many NDEs that many sort of inaccurate NDEs that have been swept under the carpet. And we can get some sense of this from the studies that have been done. So one particular study, or there are two that are particularly worth citing here. So one was a study done by Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, and it was a prospective study. So the people that they included in it, they didn't know beforehand whether they were going to have an NDE. So they were 344 cardiac arrest survivors, and they picked them without knowing if they'd had an NDE. So that's kind of what you want, right? You don't want to bias it by only picking people you already know have had an NDE. And out of the 344, 64 had some kind of NDE. Of those, 15 had some sort of experience where they felt they were outside of their bodies and looking at the world, as it were, from outside their bodies. And of those, one person had detailed enough experiences that were able to be sort of checked by the medical staff and shown to be accurate. It's actually not the case that the other 14 out of those 15 had inaccurate details. It's more just that they were not really specific enough to be able to be checked, I guess. But even let's suppose they were inaccurate, again, which is not actually the case. But let's suppose 14 out of 15 were inaccurate and one was inaccurate. So a hit rate of 1 out of 15. But that's still too high to be that hit rate, as it were, is too good to be accounted for in the manner that I was suggesting earlier, where it needs to be more like 999 out of 1,000 are kind of misses, as it were.
Right. I mean, if the odds of getting a bullseye are 1 in a million, even throwing it 10 times, even throwing it 100 times does not make it likely that you'll hit the bullseye by chance.
That's right. And I think
is, in a nutshell, the response.
That's exactly right. And 1 in 1,000 is conservative, as I would say. I think with some of the cases we talked about earlier, I think one could reasonably put much lower odds on it, on getting it right by chance. So yeah, that would be roughly.
Yeah, I would think to a more realistic estimate of randomly guessing that there's a red shoe on the roof of the hospital, a single red shoe. 1 in 100,000.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think it's more like
when you think of getting the color right, the object right, and the chances that it would be there on the roof are very low. So
I agree.
That is probably more likely. So those are some of the naturalistic explanations for these experiences. But then we have the kind of at face value interpretation or hypothesis, which we might just call the afterlife hypothesis. This was somehow conscious experience happening when the body and brain were dead. And so what is the afterlife hypothesis? Is it just somebody, we have souls, and these experiences are our souls leaving our bodies? And what are the main problems with that explanation?
Well, that I think there is clearly going to be a version of the afterlife hypothesis that involves substance dualism, the view that we are we have physical bodies, but we are immaterial minds or souls, if you like. That's going to be one version of it. However, that there is a version of the afterlife hypothesis that doesn't involve substance dualism. Of course, like some people in the Christian tradition deny substance dualism, actually, or at least with respect to human beings, and they want to think in terms of the way in which humans survive death is through bodily resurrection. So so in the paper, I try to suggest basically kind of 3 different, if you like, evidential pathways by which these NDEs, the data about NDEs, might lend support to an afterlife scenario. And one of them actually doesn't presuppose substance dualism, although the other 2 do involve substance dualism. So Yeah, I don't know if what direction we want to go in, but
I think that it would be helpful to understand, like, what is an afterlife if there's no soul? I mean, I, there are theists and Christians who think that the physical body is all we are. We don't have a soul, and that our afterlife is when we are raised from the dead. But that worldview, it seems to me, has no ability at all to explain near-death experiences, because these are experiences extrasensory well before the general resurrection at the end of the world, but also after someone has experienced brain death or cardiac arrest. So how does a Christian materialist explain that interim conscious experience post-mortem?
good. Well, I mean, this isn't my own position, the Christian materialist, but I think what they could say is something like this. They could say, look, in these cases, the person, now everyone agrees that the person, it wasn't dead in the really strict sense of the word, right? Because if they were dead, then we wouldn't know about their NDE, right? They're only dead in some kind of more loose sense of the term, which is to say they lack some of the key vital signs for a certain period of time. So I think what the Christian materialist would say is, or could say, if they didn't just try a sort of naturalistic debunking strategy, is that there is some kind of residual brain activity of the sort which is able to support some kind of paranormal perceptual mechanism. So that they're not denying that the person during their NDE, or some people during their NDE, really do see what's going on the roof above the hospital, for example. But what they would say is that it's not that the person's soul has departed their body and is looking down, but rather that they're employing some kind of paranormal perceptual mechanism that is very dimly understood, but that it is linked with brain functioning, and that there is some kind of very minimal residual brain activity going on during these experiences.
What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I think, I think the one thing I would say about that I think cuts against it somewhat is what's interesting about these NDE cases. One thing that's interesting about them is that they seem to occur across quite a wide variety of levels of brain activity, right? All the way from, someone who's been without a heartbeat for minutes, or even half an hour. The case in the Pim van Lommel paper, that the guy was without a heartbeat for a very long time. All the way through to cases where the person has a heartbeat and is simply anesthetized, and so it looks like there's a really wide range of brain states, as it were, that these NDEs can occur in conjunction with. And if the sort of outer body experience is the result of a brain-based mechanism, albeit some kind of paranormal ability to remotely view things, it does seem surprising that there would be a consistency of the phenomenology. And despite, in some cases, the person's brain is, to all appearances, basically non-functional all the way through to there's nothing wrong with the brain, they're just anesthetized. So that does seem kind of problematic for that hypothesis, I would suggest.
I agree with you, and I also think that there is something intrinsically implausible about attributing a paranormal physical capacity to the brain. Because the traditional answer, that these are instances of the soul leaving the body, evade concerns about conflict with neuroscience and physics, because we are saying these experiences result from an immaterial soul, a non-physical reality, and physical laws and principles just don't apply to that kind of a reality. But if you're saying that it's the physical brain that has these paranormal capacities, well, then shouldn't we be able to study them scientifically? It's one thing to say we can't study the soul scientifically. It's an immaterial reality. We can't get it under a microscope. But we can get the brain under a microscope. And no one, to my knowledge, has discovered these physical extrasensory capacities. So doesn't that make the hypothesis just extremely improbable, to have a very low prior probability of being true?
Yeah, possibly so. I mean, so the biggest proponent of the position we've just been talking about, the sort of, if you like, physicalist brain-based paranormal ability hypothesis, the biggest proponent of that position I'm aware of is the philosopher Michael Sudduth. So what he'll say in response to your question just then is that, well, yeah, we might not really have any idea about the neural correlates of such an ability, but we do have evidence of some kinds of extrasensory perceptual abilities in waking subjects. So we have what are known as Gansfield experiments, for example. So that there is a field of rigorous research that tries to sort of measure and establish that there are, to some degree in some people, abilities to do remote viewing and things like that. And there is, I mean, you'd actually be surprised at how much evidence there is there. But all that, I think the thing about those cases is that, to my knowledge, the waking subjects in Gansfield experiments, for example, don't have the sensation of being apart from their body. They don't experience it as though they're apart from their body and observing the room and so on from outside their bodies.
Okay, I have never heard of those. So, I mean, if that checks out, that would add some credence to this idea that there is some latent, underutilized but still real capacity in the brain for this paranormal or extrasensory perception.
Yeah, I think that.
So,
sorry.
Looking. No, go ahead.
Oh,
go ahead.
yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think to some degree, but again, I mean, I think I would come back to the point about those waking subjects have ordinarily, healthy brains, but people in these NDE cases, as I said, are in a variety of brain states, and some of them, their brain states are, to all appearances, that their brains are virtually non-functional. So that, I think, is still a difficulty for that position.
Yes, I agree with you. So looking then at the most traditional interpretation of these experiences, that they involve a person's soul leaving their body, and that in cases where they report experiences of an afterlife, not just of extrasensory perceptions, but of going into the light and conversing with loved ones who've passed away, that these experiences reflect the objective reality of the situation that these people are in, that they did move on to a real afterlife, to heaven. That's a fairly straightforward explanation. It's a powerful explanation. It's able to explain all of the evidence we have. That doesn't mean it's correct, but it means that with respect to explanatory power, you can't really do better, it seems to me, than that answer. But what are the chief naturalistic objections to this hypothesis? Aside from just offering a naturalistic explanation, are there any difficulties with this explanation on its own terms?
Well, yes, the chief objections are going to be the more general objections to substance dualism, I think. Right. So, and those being what's known as the interaction problem, and I suppose another problem would be the so-called pairing problem. So, the interaction problem is the one that Elizabeth of Bohemia famously raised when she was corresponding with Descartes, who was the well-known advocate of the dualistic view that we have, physical bodies and immaterial minds. And so, yeah, Elizabeth kind of question to Descartes that many people don't think she gets a good answer to from Descartes is, by what mechanism, as it were, does a immaterial mind bring about effects in a physical body? And so that continues to be kind of brought forward as one of the chief objections to the dualist view, which is part and parcel of the afterlife picture that you just sketched. Yeah, the pairing problem is sort of the problem of like what makes this soul, as it were, tied to this body as opposed to some other. Yeah. So what makes this my body? If I'm in fact, if what I am is an immaterial soul, what is it that kind of it establishes that this body in some sense belongs to me?
Do you think those objections are particularly difficult to answer from the dualist afterlife perspective?
No, I don't really. I mean, the interaction problem. I mean, I think I've always found it curious, to be honest, that one is felt to be so powerful, because the truth is that in there's a long-standing discussion in metaphysics about what causation is, what is the cause and effect relation, and there are various proposals on the table. One that has been influential is that of David Lewis, which is really a kind of Humean account that basically, and he's got more nuance around it, basically says, A causes B just in case B wouldn't have happened if A didn't happen. Okay, so it seems to me that if, for example, that's what we say causation is, well, I can't see any in principle barrier to saying that A is an event that is occurring in a material soul, and B is an event occurring in a physical body. There's nothing about that sort of account that in principle blocks that type of causal interaction. There's various other accounts, of course, but I think that the main point is it's not as though we have a widely agreed upon account of causation, which clearly rules out in principle that we could have immaterial to material causation. And so I think the other sort of version of the interaction problem, the other way it gets expressed is that, well, the physical universe is a causally closed system. Sometimes what's known sometimes as the causal closure principle. But I mean, and so yeah, if that principle were true, then that would be a reason. I mean, that would rule out there being interaction between an immaterial mind and a immaterial body. But I mean, I think it's the status of the causal closure principle, to me, it seems that it's more of a kind of axiom of naturalism. I mean, to put it slightly provocatively, it's a sort of article of faith. It's not the case that we have like excellent evidence for this principle. I mean, when you think about it, all we could have for it is a kind of inductive evidence, right? That says, well, in this case, we didn't need to posit an immaterial cause. In this case, we didn't need to posit an immaterial cause. But I mean, it seems like that's woefully inadequate to establish that there never is there never are any immaterial causes. I mean, that would be roughly my take on it.
Yeah, I think that appealing to the causal closure principle in particular is very unimpressive for someone who's seriously considering the possibility of an immaterial soul or an immaterial God. You wouldn't be predisposed in that situation to just assume this principle, because if any of those theories or hypotheses are true, this principle is false. So you can't assume that it's true, and then if you ask, well, what are the reasons that it's true? You're right, it would only just be this relatively weak inductive inference. I mean, that being said, surely there is some weight that we have to attach to the fact that barring near-death experiences, extracting that away from our evidence base, it seems that physical explanations are all we've ever needed for explaining physical phenomenon. That's got to count for something, right?
I definitely agree with how you just put it, for explaining physical phenomenon. But then, of course, that raises the interesting question of whether there are. I mean, so I think, the whole status of the debate in philosophy of mind around qualia, conscious experience, and whether it's reducible to physical properties or not is very much open at the moment, I think. And it's by no means just theists who are pushing the idea that physical properties are not adequate to account for all of the data. So yeah, I mean, you've got people like David Chalmers, who I'm certainly not saying Chalmers is a substance dualist, but Chalmers, at the same time, very much has made a case that I think has convinced quite a lot of people that qualia, that the what it's like to experience red or the taste of coffee, is not plausibly seen as merely a physical property of the world. So I think, I do agree that that the issue of prior probabilities is going to be very important at the end of the day in all of this. And if you're starting from a position where you assign a pretty low prior probability to theism or to substance dualism, then maybe this type of evidence we've been discussing, NDEs, is not going to move you that much closer to those things. But so really, in my paper, I fairly exclusively restricted myself to talking about how much of an evidential boost these experiences, that this data might give, rather than the question of where you started off from in terms of the prior probabilities. And I grant that if you start off with a very low prior probability for an afterlife or theism or substance dualism, then you might, even if this moves you somewhat, you might still fall well short of the sort of 50% threshold.
I think it's crucial to make that clarification about the modesty of your case, that you're not saying that it demonstrates that an afterlife exists, that the probability of an afterlife is greater than 50%, but merely that in light of near-death experiences, we ought to increase the probability or our credence in an afterlife substantially. But if you begin from an extremely low prior probability, then even a substantial increase still won't get you past 50% probability, right? So I think that's important to realize. But even so, even just showing that near-death experiences ought to count as significant probability increasing evidence for an afterlife, even that by itself is a significant claim and would be a remarkable point to establish.
No, I agree completely. Yeah.
So then, just for the sake of completeness, the causal pairing problem, what would be your response to that?
Yeah, so I think I'm probably more on the fence about what's the right response to that. I mean, the response that Richard Swinburne gives, which I don't think is a terrible one by any means, is basically to say that, so basically an important aspect of this pairing problem is the question of like what makes your soul, what individuates your soul. So we could say it's the causal relations that it stands into your body, but it's not always going to stand in those causal relations to your body. So we need something more than just that. And so, yeah, Richard Swinburne suggests that we should posit a sort of primitive thisness property, or what's sometimes called hexaity. And he thinks there's independent reasons that we should posit hexaeties anyway. But that, yeah, that there is, it's kind of just a brute individuating property that makes your soul your soul. And then it stands in certain causal relations to your body while you're alive, but it's not always going to stand in those relations to your body. So yeah, I mean, I guess I think the pairing problem is one that has been raised by people like Jae-Gwon Kim, but I guess it's generally the case that the interaction problem is seen as the really devastating problem.
Yeah, the pairing problem always struck me as kind of obscure, less less of a felt issue, at least for me, with substance dualism. It's kind of like, yeah, that's a difficult question to answer, but a lot of philosophical objections to common sense beliefs are difficult to answer. And so for some reason, this one just struck me as more akin to those like Zeno's paradoxes of motion, that, that's tough. How do we absolve these paradoxes? Even though we don't know how, it's pretty clear that there is such a thing as motion. And I don't know, once you're dealing with genuine immaterial realities, I don't know that there needs to be any deeper explanation as to why my soul is connected to this body. It just, if we think about, I think the relation there is probably just basic and fundamental, and that doesn't seem implausible to me. So, I mean, explanations have to stop somewhere, and this question of why is my soul connected to my body and not others, it's like, well, that just is the case. It just, that is the connection. So, and I don't think we could ever say anything more. When you're dealing with non-physical realities, they're not open to empirical investigation. And they don't have parts. They're non-physical. So once you're seriously entertaining the idea of a soul, I don't think you any longer will have the felt need to offer the kind of explanation that objection is looking for. So what I did want to ask you before we go is I wanted to throw some of my own objections to the dualist afterlife hypothesis that have troubled me from time to time, and see what you have to say. The first would be that if these individuals are going on to an objective and real afterlife in these near-death experiences, why doesn't everyone who experiences brain death, for example, or cardiac arrest, have a near-death experience like this? I remember reading online once on Quora Answers, the ultimate reservoir of objective and reliable information. Somebody who went into cardiac arrest, and they described it as like going under general anesthesia, winking out of existence. And they found out later that the paramedics performed CPR and tried to resuscitate them several times. And it's plausible that there was no brain activity going on for a certain period of time, and they didn't experience anything at all. So
yeah,
I'm reminded of that specific study you cited of several hundred individuals who had cardiac arrest.
Yeah.
Only 63 of them had a near-death experience.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
that seems difficult to explain. I'm all done.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose, with all of these things, you kind of have to think like, in the sort of Bayesian framework, you have broadly two hypotheses, and you're trying to say, well, does one of them make this data more to be expected than the other? And so, yeah, even if we say that it's surprising on the afterlife hypothesis that a lot of people don't recall having an NDE when they were in cardiac arrest and so on. And maybe that is not what we'd expect, but is it what we would expect on naturalism? It's not clear that we would. I mean, insofar as the naturalist has some story to tell about what causal mechanism generates these NDEs, we might still be surprised that it only kicks in, at less than a quarter of the time. The other thing to say is, I mean, something that has been explored is like whether one can kind of identify any potential variables that might be correlated with like the extent to which someone remembers having an NDE. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there is some research going on there. I mean, in a way, it's a little bit similar to the question of like, why do most people each night not remember having a dream, even though apparently, like, during REM sleep, pretty much everyone is dreaming, but it's only a fraction of the time that you actually wake up the next morning and remember what you dreamt. I don't know. It is weird, but it's also not clear to me that it's particularly strong evidence against the afterlife hypothesis.
Right. I take it that what you're saying is we can just absorb whatever improbability we might attach to the fact that only a relatively narrow selection of people actually have NDEs. The very fact that they do is so unlikely given naturalism, and so much more likely given the afterlife hypothesis, that any further improbabilities or surprising elements do not counterbalance that fact.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, if I'm not remotely attaching precise numbers to this stuff, but let's suppose you thought the strength of the evidence from these kind of corroborated experiences was sort of orders of magnitude, 100,000 times more likely on the afterlife hypothesis than on naturalism. Okay, and then in the other direction, the fact that some people, well, the majority of people don't have an NDE or don't remember having an NDE when they've been in cardiac arrest. I mean, let's say that's not what we'd expect, but I don't think it's on the order of 100,000 times more likely on naturalism than on the afterlife hypothesis.
Sure.
Would be the thought.
Sure, I think that's the reasonable answer, depending on the more precise likelihood and probability descriptions that we supply to fill out that Bayesian framework. My second set of objections really would be the evidence we have, the empirical evidence we have, that seems to indicate that conscious experience requires a functioning brain, and that if you do damage to the brain, you do damage to consciousness. And that fact would seem to call into question the possibility of a conscious experience completely detached from a functioning brain, and therefore lend credibility to the naturalistic explanations. I mean, if you undergo traumatic brain injury and survive, your conscious life will be radically altered and diminished. And as you damage the brain more and more and more, your reported conscious experiences will be more and more diminished in capacity. And so, doesn't that fact lend considerable support to the idea that once you destroy the brain entirely, there's just no conscious experience? It would be remarkable if you had this correlation between decreased brain functioning and decreased conscious experience, and then suddenly when you hit zero on the brain functionality, conscious experience just skyrockets to an experience of an afterlife.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, so I think there's something to that. And I do think that the general observation of the correlation between brain functionality and conscious experience does, if we bracket out the other stuff we've been discussing, I think that does kind of raise the probability of some kind of materialist hypothesis. Certainly, I think that is really the best evidence for the materialist hypothesis about the mind, right? Now, so I guess, well, two things I'd mention. So one is that there's a phenomenon known as terminal lucidity, which seems to be very surprising given that hypothesis. The hypothesis that brain functionality and conscious experience just kind of are one and the same. So terminal lucidity is this phenomenon that's been, there's a good bit of research that's been done on it in the last few years, whereby someone who is subject to normally kind of terminal cognitive decline because of degenerative brain disease normally, such that they're, from a neuroscientific perspective, they get to a point where their brain really shouldn't be able to support lucid personality and conscious experience by any means. They, what will happen in most of these cases is can vary from minutes to even maybe a whole day. The person will sort of just snap back suddenly and is sort of very lucid, vividly kind of present, normally shortly before their death, despite the fact that their brain is in an extremely poor condition and shouldn't be able to support this kind of vivid personality anymore. So so that's one interesting data point or set of data points that I think doesn't fit comfortably with the materialist story. But the other thing then is so maybe what this suggests is that the dualist hypothesis. I mean, the dualist hypothesis in any case has to take seriously the massive correlations between brain functioning and conscious experience, right? Descartes tried to do this in a slightly kind of hand-waving way and said there's this little bit of the brain called the pineal gland where the soul and the body interact, and that's not taken seriously anymore. But clearly, dualists need a story to tell about why it is that at least the vast majority of the time brain functioning is correlated very tightly to conscious experience. And I think the story that the dualist should tell is going to need to be something like this. So, I mean, one analogy that you might use that's been given is sort of to think of the brain as, rather than being the originator of consciousness, it's what you might call the transducer of consciousness. So you think of an old-fashioned transistor radio, and you can kind of fiddle around with the components. You take the back off, you pull some wires out, and you notice that the quality of the audio coming through the speaker has been degraded. And you keep doing this, and you might form the hypothesis that when you're ripping out some of the wires, you're reducing its capacity to generate the sound, but that's not actually what you're doing. You're rather degrading its capacity to transduce the signal that's being generated elsewhere and turn it into sound through the speaker. So you can probably get the gist of where I'm going with it. That I think roughly that's how the dualist might think of what's going on in terms of the way that the immaterial mind relates to the brain. And so I suppose then that what the dualist is going to say about NDE cases is that there can be damage to the brain that's significant enough to temporarily rupture that connection altogether, such that the mind ceases to function via the brain.
I think one analogy I've heard that's, I think, functionally the same as yours is the an analogy to a musician, and you can
a pianist,
specifically pick just the piano.
Yeah.
That the mind uses the brain as an instrument of thought.
Yeah.
And just as the piano player uses the piano to produce music, the piano unto itself cannot produce music. It is the piano player using it that makes it. Similarly, the brain by itself cannot produce conscious experience as the soul using the brain to do so. But those analogies taken at face value would seem to cut against the grain of the idea of an afterlife, wouldn't they? If you destroy the piano, there's no music. There is a pianist, but there's no music. And if you destroy the brain, there's no conscious experience, even if there's a soul. So that's just always been my worry in thinking about that kind of dualism.
It
lends to it makes it ad hoc, doesn't it, to then say that there's a different capacity for consciousness when there's no brain. It feels ad hoc.
I mean, I think it would be especially ad hoc if there were no evidence. Right? So I guess the suggestion is going to be that if we'd never heard of NDEs, we would have no reason to take that hypothesis seriously, but that given NDEs, actually, yes, it is a little weird and slightly awkward, but maybe, at least unless you have a vanishingly low prior for the afterlife or dualism and so on, that this is kind of the best way to make sense of all the data.
Yes. I think you're probably right that that's the best we can say at the present moment. And that might well be enough. But you're right. If we have strong evidence for near-death experiences that will validate this otherwise ad hoc adjustment to the dualist story.
And I think,
but it does still seem strange.
Oh, it does.
It doesn't seem elegant,
no,
right, and smooth.
And the other thing to say is that I think NDEs and maybe other related phenomena. I alluded to terminal lucidity. There's other phenomena besides, which we haven't talked about. I think one could see these as being evidence for hypotheses that we otherwise would not have taken seriously just on the basis of a priori philosophical reflection, right? So, I mean, dualism as a kind of hypothesis in the philosophy of mind debate often hasn't been framed in terms of souls having a location in space, right? I mean, Descartes actually said more or less that the essence of thinking stuff, the essence of souls is to be immaterial. Is to be without spatial extension, right? And the essence of material things is to have spatial extension. And so I don't think I don't think one has to accept that. But all I'm saying is that when dualism has been argued for purely kind of a priori, it doesn't necessarily lead you to think that the soul would have some of the properties that these NDEs might suggest they do.
That's a good point. And by a priori reasoning, you mean like thought experiments, philosophical reflection, as opposed to scientific empirical evidence.
Exactly, just armchair reflection.
Right. Well, Max, this has been brilliant. And before we go, I wrote this down ahead of time, and you should see this curveball coming, given our prior conversation. But I wanted to read out a quote from physicist and arch-naturalist Sean Carroll on his take on near-death experiences. He engaged in a public debate on this topic. Is death the end, or something like that, several years back. And here's what he said. And I want to read it out to you, and then I'll get your response. Claims that some form of consciousness persists after our bodies die and decay into their constituent atoms face one huge, insuperable obstacle. The laws of physics underlying everyday life are completely understood, and there's no way within those laws to allow for the information stored in our brains to persist after we die. If you claim that some form of soul persists beyond death, what particles is that soul made of? What forces are holding it together? How does it interact with ordinary matter? And he concludes, believing in life after death, to put it mildly, requires physics beyond the standard model. Now, I think this is a hopelessly confused objection. But what do you think, Max?
I mean, it sounds to me like he's just assuming that physicalism is true and then saying, given physicalism, there can't be life after death. I mean, am I being uncharitable?
I think you're not far off. It's hard to read him any other way. Because the hypothesis isn't that there is this physical thing called a soul that has brand new properties that are scientifically explicable.
Right.
He's so wedded to naturalism that he can't even properly conceive of the alternative hypotheses. He just couches them into physicalist terms.
Yeah, which which Richard Dawkins kind of has done when he's talked about what God would be like. God more or less has to be this kind of big physical object floating around somewhere. It's interesting.
Yes. So I think in a nutshell response is that dualism does not maintain that the soul is a reality amenable to scientific investigation. It's not the hypothesis that there is a brand new set of physical forces and principles that allows the person to survive into an afterlife. It's that there is a non-physical reality. And you might find that objectionable and ad hoc and problematic, but you can't object to it purely on the basis of the fact that it's positing interactions that aren't scientifically or physically
Right.
explicable, because this is a non-physical reality.
Right. Right.
It's only if we assume the physical world is all there is that we would have to explain everything physically. So, and that would just be question begging. So, yes. Well, Max, did you have anything else you wanted to say or ask or discuss today?
Well, no, thank you so much for having me, Miles. Yeah, I mean, as I, I've referenced it already, but the paper, I mean, has more detail, and but hopefully people have got the gist of what I was saying there. But yeah, you could, if you Google me, you can find an open access version of that paper on my academia.edu page. Yeah,
Yep.
thank you so much for having me, Miles.
Of course. I'll have the paper linked in the show notes and on the YouTube video as a link that pops up during our discussion. But thank you for coming on the show, Max. This was utterly fascinating. I think people are going to get a lot from this conversation about such a fascinating topic. So I appreciate it.
Thanks, Miles.